Thank you, everyone. Thanks everyone that is joining me online and everyone that is here. My name is Abril Saldaña, and I'm going to be presenting on from court to clinical trials, what I see the troubling coupling of abortion politics and governance over of reproductive breakthroughs. I developed this work while I was in Bellagio. I had the luck, I was very lucky to be in Bellagio in February. So I thank the Bellagio residency and the Rockefeller Foundation for that opportunity. How do I see it? Maybe click. Oh, there. Okay. So what I'm going to be presenting is part of a project that I'm doing, a book that I'm writing about what I call disruptive reproduction. In my book, I talk about genomics, reproductive breakthroughs, and the global health agenda of the 21st century. I've been very interested, and I've been working through our global Wellcome Trust project on issues of heritable human genome editing. So what you can see here is the chapters of the book that I'm writing. It is going to be a book that talks about how the global South is placed in this sort of reproductive breakthroughs agenda of the 21st century. I was very into heritable human genome editing, and I thought I cannot talk about those issues and of those ethical dilemmas if I don't go through the history of, for instance, breast cancer, or how the scandal of human genomes was discussed in Mexico, what the narrative, the anxieties, and how scientists and medicine sort of made sense of that and moved around human cloning at the beginning of the 21st century. I look at epigenetics, and of course, I look at clinical trials in court cases, and this is what I'm presenting today. So I would like to start by looking at,
everybody online needs to mute their microphone.
Please, thank you, sorry. Okay, so at the beginning of this month, I attended the summit on the International Summit on Human Genome Editing. It was a fascinating event of 3 days, March 6th to the 8th, and it was hosted by the Francis Crick Institute, and it gathered an array of life and social scientists, bioethicists, lawyers from around the world. It was a very pretty amazing event. So the first 2 days, I'm not going to go through the first 2 days, but the first 2 days were basically much focused on the history of the summits, very much living the scandal of the CRISPR babies in the past somehow, and on somatic genome editing and the scientific advances on gene therapy and sickle cell disease. So we talk about prices, accessibility, accountability, and of course governance. But then the summit left the issue of reproductive human genome editing for the third day and the last day. And there was one presentation that was like no other. There was one presentation that really it provoked the most emotionally charged reaction from the audience, very passionate reaction from the audience, and that was the presentation of Tina Rulli. So in her presentation, Tina Rulli questioned the social value of reproductive human genome editing, and she was quoted by someone at the panel saying in one of her latest paper, "It is both a metaphysical and a moral stretch to call a not yet created or unimplanted embryo a patient, since its existence is not a given." So in a way, Tina was asking, is having or pursuing genetically linked children a right from bodily autonomy and reproductive freedom? So this is my question. I think this is one of the most interesting and most challenging questions of our time. So what I would like to ask in this presentation is what are the implications of these rights for abortion politics? Are we calling now embryos patients, for instance? And what are the implications for reproductive justice as a whole? And what I mean by this is how women are involved in clinical trials. as donors, for instance, as donors of wombs, eggs, or body for research of clinical trials. So the aim of my presentation is to explore abortion politics in Latin America in the context of in alliance with reproductive breakthroughs and the reproductive market. So I'm going to look at one core case, that's Artavia Murillo, and I'm going to look at two clinical trials. One that happened in Mexico recently. One is the MRT case in Guadalajara in 2017, and another one is the uterine lavage. So what I want to suggest in this presentation in my chapter is that I warn against abortion politics getting caught up by the reproductive or the growing reproductive market agenda. So following reproductive justice approach, I want to suggest that the pursuit of genetic relatedness as a right must be questioned by unpacking the implications of this notion. For abortion politics and for women defined as the necessary means to exercise that right. In other words, I would like to suggest that there are some women that are being defined as the technologies of life to which the courts are giving granted or giving granted as a form of a right. I will also like to call attention to the silent adjacent technologies, products, services that are being evolving or developing and that shape reproductive experiences of women in the global south. Okay, so zooming out before going into the core case, I would like to look at abortion politics in Latin America. So Latin American feminists have persistently in the last years and efficiently pushed for abortion liberation. So we have very important victories in Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, Uruguay, and many other countries. Latin American abortion liberation and the networks have sparkled hopes across the continent, so much that American feminists are asking themselves, what can we learn from Mexico? What can we learn from from Latin America? So we have seen a lot of interviews of Latin American feminists and Latin American very important figures in the abortion politics agenda being interviewed. What can we learn from you? What are the sort of the advice that you give us now after Roe v. Wade was overturned? So I've been trying to identify these advices, and these are basically four. One, don't rely too much on the state. The other one, who needs doctor as gatekeepers? So they talk about self-managed abortion in terms of medical abortion, for instance. The third one is organized network of acompañantes. That means women that accompany other women, right? So one of the slogans, one of the calls that we hear in a lot of Latin American feminist protests, right, during the last year is, the state doesn't take care of me, my friends do. The police doesn't take care of me, my friends do. So over and over, Latin American feminists have been saying, don't trust the state, and actually you don't need the state, right? That's the advice. The fourth advice is control the narrative of the movement. So a lot of Latin Americans, for instance, the head of IPAS in Central America and Mexico, Maria Antonieta, has said during an interview, be very careful because about this big organization taking control of the whole thing. She was saying Americans have been very isolated. They forgot to create these networks that we're now using. And also they have let big organizations take over the whole movement. So they control the narrative. So for instance, if it's Planned Parenthood, then it is all about Planned Parenthood. It is not about the movement. So be very, very careful with that. So, but the whole, you know, and a lot of Latin American feminists are saying Americans used to be our goal, you know, we look up to them. And now that this is happening, we are very glad that we have years and years of this network building. We have the American Women of the Year Award in Time Magazine, gave it to Veronica Cruz, who is the leader of one of the organizations in Guanajuato, actually. She's from Guanajuato. A very important figure in the region. So in an interview, for instance, one of the head of a network called Las Glories in Tijuana said this legalization has never been our end goal. They were celebrating the Supreme Court decision in Mexico to decriminalize abortion. And she asked for, of course, free abortion, but free in many ways, free as in liberated, she said, free from stigma, free from medicalized control, free, decriminalized, legalized, it doesn't matter, we are here for you. So that's what the whole networking thing is about. But of course, we have women that have been prosecuted for abortion up to 8 years. I remember when I arrived to Guanajuato, there were women sentenced to 30 years in prison in Mexico. And actually, Veronica Cruz, that you see here, was in charge and was basically heading the movement to get the women out of prison. So courts have been used, and courts have been increasingly used, and that has not happened without intra-movement tensions. Do we use courts? How do we use courts? What do we do with courts? Because of course, you know, you need courts if you want to get women out of prison, but then you have to be careful what happened with courts. So one of the things is that, for instance, the judiciary, for many feminists in the movement, the judiciary is a site of masculine domination and the source of gender oppression and injustice. So they're very, very much untrusting the courts. Others have pointed to the co-opted character of the law, the limitations of litigations, and the difficulty, of course, of implementing decisions, right? So you have the court on your side, but then what do you do with that after? Communitarian feminists have been calling for a political project that goes beyond the states. Indigenous women, also from countries like Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, have pledged for this political project that goes beyond the state. Mapuche woman in Chile called the latest reform, abortion reform, a form of coloniality, Western Europe, and above all, white feminists. This is not our agenda. Why? Because the reform was not enough for Mapuche women. It didn't, the exceptions to criminalizations were not enough. So they didn't recognize the state decision in that way. Communitarian feminists have insisted that the state control over their bodies and their expropriation of territories from their people were simultaneous expression of patriarchal colonial power. So there is a lot of intra-movement tension there. So amidst the serving celebration for abortion rights in Latin America, I believe that just as Americans are turning to us, I think we should learn from what from the American experience. And I'm not talking about the overturn of Roe v. Wade, but the passing of Roe v. Wade. What happened when Roe v. Wade was passed? And what I think what happened in terms of the context and the environment is Roe v. Wade was 2 years before Asilomar. And Asilomar was a gathering of scientists that were going to decide for the future of science in America. Asilomar is known, well, the objective of Asilomar was to discuss recombinant DNA and what they were going to do with our DNA in the future. So, but there have been many sort of analysis of Asilomar, and the idea of Asilomar was to basically define scientists as self-governed. So scientists were able to basically ethically decide on the future of science, and they didn't need any sort of law to regulate science or scientists themselves. So there was this, I think that this coincidence of Roe v. Wade and Asilomar is giving us a lot of pause for caution in terms of what is the context of a court case, of a landmark abortion case. So now I'm going to turn to Artavia Murillo, which is the first court case that I'm going to analyze. So the first thing that I want to make very, very clear is that Artavia Murillo was officially a case about IVF and the access to assisted reproduction, but everyone knew and everyone knows Artavia Murillo as a landmark case for abortion politics. No one ever mentioned abortion throughout the years of the case, but they knew that it was an abortion case. So there were a lot of, someone mentioned something, they call it like, over the years, the list of people involved in the case grew to read like the who is who of transnational feminist activists for and against abortion, so that there were NGOs, regional activists, human rights clinics, law scholars, many of them from America. Why? Because Artavia Murillo was a case of 9 heterosexual couples taking the state of Costa Rica to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, because Costa Rica, since the year 2000, forbidden IVF due to the personhood of the embryo and the protection of life, the interpretation of the American Convention in Article 4 about the protection of life from conception. So that's why Costa Rica was forbidding IVF to these 9 couples. So the 9 couples took the state of Costa Rica to the court. So it was an IVF, but because the justification of Costa Rica to forbid an IVF was the status of the embryo, it became very quickly an abortion a case. So the gains of that case, of the ruling of that case, was the following. So in Artavia Murillo, the court refused to grant the status of person to the embryo at conception. So that was a cause for celebration, of course, for abortion politics in Latin America. But then, because it was an IVF case, the court also decided the following: establish maternity as an essential part of the free development of a woman's personality, which I think is a huge backlash for the way that feminists have been fighting for detaching women's personalities from maternity. Infertility as a genuine state of illness, which I think is also very problematic. Florencia Luna from Chile, she's a bioethicist from Chile. She has a very interesting analysis of how Latin American infertility, by defining it as an illness, is forgetting all the women that are infertile because of untreated sexual transmitted diseases and unsafe abortion. So she's asking, like, why are we defining infertility as a disease of this of a certain kind, as a disease that affects certain people, and not infertility as something that is preventable if we will have access to public health. So I think that that's also something that we need to watch out in terms of Artavia Murillo. And also the court established the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific project, which is okay. But if you link it to the next one, and I think the next one is, for me, the most problematic, is genetical relatedness. So the court established the freedom to decide becoming a mother or a father in the genetic or biological sense. So is this, and this is my question, being mobilized to define embryos as patients? Or what, I mean, how do we think about genetic relatedness as a right established by a court, and by a court in this way? And I think that in what is coming, and the clinical trials that I'm going to be analyzing, are going to sustain my claim that this is the most problematic ruling of the court. And this is why I think that this troubling, that there's a sort of problem, some friction there between, with this alliance of abortion politics and reproductive technologies. So Lamatre and Cedar had this very interesting analysis about Artavia, and what they did was they look at how their argument is that when courts are involved, social movements moderate their claims. So they look at Artavia Murillo and they highlight how feminists, in a way, moderate their narrative, but also accommodated to some of the court's language and some of the things that we're seeing here. They align to notions of maternity. They align to notions of women having this urge to be mothers. They align to a lot of things that they usually don't align. They never mention abortion as something related to rights and the rights of privacy, never mentioned. The conservative side also moderated some of the language that conservative groups use in these cases, such as the culture of death and all that thing that they usually use in this kind of cases. So this is what I think it was problematic from Artavia Murillo, and I'm going to use 2 clinical trials that recently happened in Mexico to prove this or to sustain my claim. So I'm going to have a sip of liquid before I follow, because this is the most technical part. Okay, so this is in 2016. A UK newspaper that announced the first baby born after mitochondrial transfer techniques. So the mitochondrials are membrane-bound cell organs that generate most of the chemical energy needed to power the cell's biochemical reaction. So of course, any deficit in the pathways that the mitochondria usually functions with is associated with infertility or with serious genetic diseases. So MRTs involve basically removing nuclear DNA from an intended mother, oocyte or egg, and then transferring it to a donor's egg with healthy mDNA, from which nuclear DNA has been previously removed. In other words, you basically transfer or replace nuclear DNA from one egg to the other one, to the one with healthy mitochondria. So the case involved a Jordanian couple looking for fertility services in the US, a team of US and Mexican physicians. An implantation happened in New York while conception happened in Mexico. It was a male embryo, and one of the scientists involved declared that this was more ethical because if you conceive a male embryo, you don't have the male embryo won't inherit the modification or the genetic modification to future generations. So in a way, scientists saw a male embryo as a better option in terms of ethics. When the sort of news came out, someone interviewed the US doctor, and he said that they went to Mexico because they asked him, why did you went to Mexico for the implantation? And he responded, because in Mexico there are no rules. So after this no rules narrative, the Mexican media engaged in a huge campaign of changing the narrative. Like they defined the MRT as a national achievement. They were like the very high rating host in programs, inviting the doctor and scientists and basically officials from the FDA in Mexico, which is Abril. And they were all saying, well, this is going to be a great opportunity to develop regulation. And this just proves that Mexico is in the cutting edge of technology. So everyone was very celebratory about the MRT, even though we didn't have any regulation for it. So one of them even mentioned that it has the eagle of the stamp with a legend made in Mexico. So there was a lot of like fuss going on around the MRT. But the thing is that we actually don't have any regulation. So there have been many ethical debates about the MRT babies. The question if it's as a therapeutic or not therapeutic characters. Are embryos again, are embryos patients that we could sort of save if we do this kind of procedures? There is a very interesting debate between Baylis and Palacios and Cavalier about MRTs for lesbian mothers. Will lesbian mother have the right to go through an MRT so they can both be genetically related to the children? So again, genetic relatedness comes into view. But in any case, the procedure was illegal. I mean, they did broke the law. So Palacios and Medina have a very interesting analysis of Mexican regulation. But then I encountered this report from the National Commission of Bioethics, and it was about the case. Very short time after the case, the commission issued a report, and there the commission advised to look at Artavia Murillo. The commission didn't say why, but I think it just mentioned the principles and guidance of Artavia Murillo to look at the MRT case in Mexico. So what I want to suggest with the MRT is that we haven't decided anything about the ethics of the procedure. We don't have any law for it. The commission said, even though we don't explicitly forbid the MRT, we don't have a regulatory framework that will sustain the MRT. So in a way that the case broke the law, and even if we don't have any conclusion about the ethical debates around it or any laws that will sustain something like this, the Commission recommends looking at Artavia Murillo. And with this, what I want to suggest is that Artavia Murillo, the scope of Artavia Murillo is way beyond IVF and is way beyond abortion politics, and that is something that we need to take into consideration. We use, when there's this alliance between abortion politics and a court case like Artavia Murillo, we need to watch out for how exactly it's going to be mobilized and in which ways and when. So this is the second clinical trial that I would like to look at, and it's the uterine lavage. So the uterine lavage is a case that was published by Human Reproduction. It's a study that happened in 2019 and 2020. So the aim of the study is very ambiguous. In the same time period, you can see that the authors first mentioned that the aim is to compare the morphology scores and chromosome euploid, which is variation in number in chromosomes of in vivo and in vitro blastocytes of fertilized egg. So how can you compare an egg, an embryo that is conceived in vivo inside a woman's womb and outside, which an IVF? But then after the authors don't report on any findings, so they didn't find any significant differences between in vivo and in vitro embryos. They describe as the first objective of the study to evaluate the feasibility of uterine lavage following ovarian stimulation to recover blastocytes for analysis, and for the authors, that goal was achieved. So basically, the whole clinical trial was to test a patented device by Previvo Genetics, which is this that you can see here. This is the device that is patented. It was being tested in Mexico, called the uterine lavage. So it functions like a vacuum cleaner. Is assigned to recover embryos conceived in vivo. For the researchers, and I quote, the uterine lavage offers a non-surgical, minimally invasive strategy for recovery of embryos from fertile women who do not want or need IVF for medical reasons, but desire a pre-implantation genetics test for fertility preservation and for embryos or reciprocal IVF for lesbian couples. In other words, this is a product or a service that they are developing for the industry. So there's nothing to do with therapeutics or with any medical needs. So who was involved? There were 81 young women, Mexican women from Nayarit, Mexico, from 18 to 35 years old age. However, there are 500 women that are expected to take part according to the registration of the clinical trial in the US. They were paid $1,400 for their participation, and they were subjected to the following. So the 81 participants underwent ovarian stimulation to induce the production of multiple mature eggs. Subsequently, these women were inseminated by non-partner sperm. 4 to 6 days later, using the device, the uterine lavage was used to collect or attempt to collect the blastocytes to then proceed with genetic testing for aneuploids. So basically pre-implantation diagnosis after that. However, 20 of the women participants, the study refers to them as lavage subjects, but they're women, were also subjected to a single IVF cycle. So it was a control IVF cycle that they were going to compare. So basically there were 21 of them underwent twice with ovarian stimulation. Now, up to 11 women reported implantation after the lavage. So, and then after that, the medical team proceeded with medical abortion. And this is the state of Nayarit. So the study involves subjecting women not only to the known risk of ovarian hyperstimulation, but also to prosecution, as abortion is criminalized in the state where it happened, Nayarit. They were not from Nayarit, they were from Jalisco, which is worse because it has worse prosecution rates for women that proceed with an abortion. This was allegedly agreed with participants via informed consent, according to the authors. By the way, all the authors are shareholders of Previvo Genetics and or employers of Previvo Genetics. So Pennings writes on the ethics of the uterine lavage also in human reproduction, and he when looking at medical abortion, he concludes that women who consider a pregnancy of this kind, which is what abortion or medical abortion in a trial, as a major psychological burden, would not have volunteered for this research project. So that's the answer, or that's basically the ethical the ethical conclusion that he has. So I don't really know how many times, how many books, how many discussions of the notion of autonomy do we have to have so that we stop seeing notions of autonomy and choice being mobilized in this way to justify violence, injustice, and also in the context of mainstream academia. So women were paid, as I said, $1,400. That amounts to 70 days or more of salary of the average Mexican. 40% or more than 40% of the population in Mexico is living below national poverty. Violence against women is scaling in ways that we have never seen before. An average of 10 women a day are killed in the face of near total impunity. Women that participated in this study were from the state of Jalisco, and that's one of the states with the highest number of feminicides in Mexico. The highest numbers of feminicides in Mexico, the highest 10 states with the most numbers of feminicides. In this context, the argument of free choice is frankly insulting. So the ethical boards, the members of the ethical board in human reproduction receive advice from reviewers saying, don't publish this piece because it's unethical. So they got together, and I quote, after much debate and then more debates, we decided to publish. They titled their commentary as Ethics Beyond Ethics, which I also find it insulting and ridiculous to call something ethics beyond ethics, because I don't really know what they mean. So basically they decided to publish because what they say is that they were going to respect the authorities that were giving permission to this study. And the authorities were, one, Profits Ethical Review Board, which are increasingly being used in the global south, and I think also in the US. So it's an ethical review board that is paid to have a view on what is going on, and also by the state of Nayarit. So what I wanted to present on the uterine lavage, because I think this clinical trial shows the following. First is that for the state, the provision of abortion has never been a moral concern over the embryos. It is about who is the moral subject, who takes the decision, because in this case, the state is allowing doctors in a clinical trial, in a clinical facility center, to take the decision that women can proceed with medical abortion and no one will prosecute or do anything or mention anything. So it has never been about, for the state, about the status of the embryo. So why? I mean, and I want you to think about that in the context of Artavia. That was supposed to be our game. The embryos were not conceived as persons, but that has never been the worry of the state, because I think the uterine lavage is showing us that that's just not the problem. So abortion seems to be permitted only if women do not act as moral subjects of their own bodies and pregnancies. In the name of scientific progress, and when doctors, entrepreneurs, and for-profit review boards act as the moral gatekeepers of women's reproductive bodies. When we discuss the ethical, social, political implications of reproductive breakthroughs, whether it's synthetic biology, human genome editing, or uterus transplants, we rarely look at implications of the silent adjacent technologies that develop around them. So I think that we have a lot of really very interesting discussions about the MRT or about human genome editing, but we never look at these sort of corners where other things are developing, such as this device of the uterine lavage. There is probably going to be that they are already developing a lot of things that were not in the, on the table for our discussions and analysis. And I think we need to be very vigilant about what is being developed around the things that we actually discussing. What we need for these breakthroughs to be developed, and who is going to lose in that process. So the trails that I presented also show important challenges for the global governance of health, because in both cases, I think we're not seeing really medical tourism here. We're seeing something that we call in this, that we can think about it with the term more circuits of use. So actually in the summit, Baltimore, who is this Nobel laureate of medicine, said something about national states developing regulations, because it was very impossible to think about an international regulation that will sort of look over the governance of these technologies. But as you can see here, we already have something that will require some form of international governance, because you have not only patients, but you have tools, you have families, you have physicians traveling to one place and another. And so this basically is already beyond the national state. So what I want to read a quote from Badotti when she calls for attention to the price we're paying for what she calls our prosthetic promises of perfectible futures. And she said something, and I quote, the cyber evokes simultaneously the triumphant charge of Schwarzenegger's Terminator and the frail bodies of those workers whose juices mostly sweat, and I added womb's eggs, fuel the technological revolution. So I think that we need to pay attention to the way we are imagining or creating this notion of a cyber mother in a way, but we're also having these other bodies that are being involved in this technological and exciting revolution of breakthroughs and reproductive breakthroughs.
Now, I'm wondering about this. I'm fascinated by uterine lavage because it's in a way quite an old technology as well. It's used routinely in agriculture for horses and for cows to distribute the sort of best bred cows' embryos across various cows to basically be surrogates for them. And this is a very unethical trial, and it's been discussed in the within sort of the professionals community a lot and being criticized for it. And I think it's really interesting that it's Santiago Monet who's doing that trial, because he's one of the major proponents of PGT, of the genetic testing, and has a lot of, it's a very controversial figure in relation to that. And so yeah, there's effort, and there's the issue about the embryo as patient, there's the issue of the way in which women were treated. But I'm also wondering if you could see this technology in other ways, like if you could see this technology as reshaping what a pregnancy might mean and what its temporality might mean, whether there is any sort of more radical progressive potential with this technology as well, or whether you read it as something that is, building something in a direction that we don't want to go to. Like, can you imagine this being used in ways that would serve women rather than exploit them, or create an adjacency to anti-abortion politics?
The technology itself.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it depending on how the technology is used. I mean, in terms of complying with proper ethical boards and procedures and permissions, but I think that the way that the whole technological or reproductive breakthrough has also sparked a lot of hopes around, you know, this post-human politics, and there have been a lot of discussions around how great it could be to sort of challenge that we perceive reproduction or pregnancy. Yes, there are, and it is being sold as technologies that's progressive technologies that will open many ways of conceiving reproduction, and I think that's fine. But what I don't think is okay is to have a technology that is so contradictory in the way that, for instance, in this case, conceives medical abortion. So, because even if Mexico has been having a lot of progress in terms of abortion politics, we still have a very much sort of a regulatory environment and also a social environment that prosecutes women for medical abortions. So what I don't think that it's okay is to have this, again, this sort of discourse of it's not really the medical abortion who takes the decision for it. So what I think that we need to very watch out is the way that women are denied being the moral subjects of whatever they do with their own bodies, and how in these clinical trials allow us to see that contradiction, because, you know, it's okay if you do it here, but it's not okay if you do it that way. So it's not much the way that the technologies will be used, but the way that technologies are being used right now, in that sort of contradictory way.
Lucy.
Yeah, thank you. That was sort of my question kind of adjacent to that, because something about this whole process of this clinical trial also reminded me of like the history of like feminist self-help and menstrual extraction. And like, would we feel differently about this particular sequence of events, like the IVF, the IUI, or however these people are getting pregnant, the lavage, the abortion, right? So there's like these 4, 5, 6 procedures that these people went through, and would we feel different? Would it feel different if it was located in like a compañera network or something, or a feminist self-help network that is in the same kind of geography, I suppose. Yeah, and just what was, has anybody asked the people, the women, how they experience the child? How did they experience it?
No, we don't know.
Yeah.
No, we don't know. We don't know. We don't have access. I think it will be impossible to have access to the participants. But we know, well, we know that they're not from Nayarit, which I think that's a very interesting subject, because they were brought from Jalisco, from another state, and the state of Nayarit gave them permission for it. So I don't know how that worked, but we don't really know a lot about the women that participated in the study, and that's why it gets actually worse to read about the ethics of it, and someone saying, well, they knew, or they should have known better than that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, actually, so you go first.
Sorry, I don't.
It's just I think so. I think connect both the Lucy question and what Lucy was getting at, or both Lucy. Is so I think largely has the possibility of technology. I think one of the last quotes was about that potential or something, right? But I think it makes so clearly how it is so located in context, and that our current world and the context of that, those possibilities are, you know, we can't live this future imaginary right now. Those lives are right now. That is a problem. And I think for me, something you said about women not being seen as moral subjects. I think, yes, that is a huge issue. But it's also that women, even if they were seen as moral subjects, it's that they were second to a profit. They're second to a commercial possibility. But it's not a problem for me, at least, with this. If this is a technology that isn't publicly owned, this is a technology that profits a set of shareholders and a company, then all of that is the primary reason. And our concept or question of moral subjectivity is always secondary to that. And I think that's also part of this. Like, what do we give up or lose? Is not just the questions that are questions that come up for our abortion policies, it's a broader question of what are we setting there to. So all of these possibilities will set into someone else's interests that are above this. I think that comes across so clearly in the work. And I guess my question after this comment is, sorry, I'm usually not that person.
That's okay.
Is so how do we so you started out by talking about this reclaiming that legalization with abortion is not and absolutely who's the state there? Those are always the ones. And I wonder, is there a way forward that we can see for technologies like this? How do we move through that? How do we, what is the place where we can come back to the original question?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, the first point that I wanted to make was watch out for courts, for the things that we, so for the sacrifices, so for the price that we pay for alliances that may not, basically for strategic litigation. I am very worried about strategic litigation in that way because it's being mobilized in ways that I don't really like. The whole point about the 2 clinical trials was to ask, did we really win with Artavia? Maybe we did, but I'm looking into it. Like, what did we give in exchange of something that is really not that central in terms of embryos and personhood? Because apparently, for the state, at least in Mexico, it's not really central because they're giving permissions for this. And what you say about about profit is also part of the reproductive justice claim of networks of acompañantes, in terms of clinics charging $200 or $300 for sleepers and snacks if you go through an abortion, and maybe less if you don't receive any kind of emotional care. So what they're saying is that we'll do it for you. And maybe, yes, maybe technologies will be different if women are in charge of them, or compañeras, or, you know, like people that will be there for you in this way. So it's not, I don't think it's a technology itself. And I know that it's a technology that is not, for instance, human genome editing, we're not there yet, but I think there are something that, I think there are reproductive imaginaries that are being around, and they are also, even if they are very abstract, they are also very harmful because they keep appearing and appearing to justify actual acts of violence, such as, you know, this bioethicist saying, well, you know, they should have known better than that. They volunteer for a pregnancy of this kind, or the editorial board. You know, one of the things that I thought about the editorial board, and this is very important, is that when they say, well, we debated and debated and then debated again, and then we decided for this. And I was thinking how much the human genome editing people have discussed consensus, social consensus, and how many times we have asked, what do you mean by consensus? How is someone asking people? Because they keep saying, yeah, well, let's ask everyone, let's have social consensus. So when I was reading this, was like, oh, that's what they mean by social consensus. 3 people in the editorial board discussing and debating, and then, you know, that is if that's the social consensus that we're looking for in these new technologies of life, then I think we are in trouble. I think that's the social consensus that we must be worried about. So I'm not against the technology itself, but against the ideas and notions that are being mobilized, and also about the contradictions of the technology developments themselves.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your paper. There's so much in there. You're telling us so much, and you could approach it from a whole range of perspectives. So I'm not quite there yet with how you frame it. This is a book in itself, clearly. No, you have the legal aspect, you have the moral aspect, you have the technological aspect, and a whole bunch more. Actually, so when you ended your presentation, and you ended with so women are the technology, so women's bodies are becoming the technology. And to be honest, I really don't know, they're not the technology, they're the labor. So they're being mobilized as labor. And so similar to Rishita's comment, actually, So what you're telling us about, with that wonderful map with all the links and between sort of the different suppliers of labor, technology, and knowledge and capital, is that the story fits. You could frame it very clearly in a sort of a global political economy framework. Fast fashion works the same, you know, or women working in factories for women in the global south for very little money, or the benefit of women in the global north who can then buy clothing in main shops, or domestic workers from the Philippines who leave their families behind and go and work in London suburbs, so that the London suburb moms can go and work and have a career somewhere. So this global political economy and how that reproduces inequality between regions, but also amongst women, and it's sold in different. So the big capitalist who gains from this will always sell it in a way that sounds emancipatory for everyone, no? So it's good for the global north because women in the global north can buy cheap clothes or can go to work and have somebody else doing domestic work. In this case, can have access to reproductive technologies that otherwise we won't know about. And the poor women in the global south, well, actually, they also need $1,500 because they're poor and they chose and they knew about the risks. And so, you know, it's good for them as well. And the same arguments are in these other industries also used. No, and so global inequality is then reproduced and reproduced. And the morality of that is always pushed aside because it's changed in a sort of it's emancipatory for everyone to a certain extent. And what you say very clearly never seems to be about actual. It's the actual ethical aspect is irrelevant because it's about global capitalism. Who makes money? And it's not only so I guess if there is a question in my story, where's the patriarchy here? So it's very clearly capitalist story, no?
Yeah.
But there's a patriarchal story here as well, or there's a misogyny story here. Women's bodies don't matter really. You know, somebody else for profit decides if abortion in certain circumstances is acceptable or not, imprisonment. Women's bodies don't matter here. So there's a misogyny question. But is there also sort of a patriarchal question? What does it reproduce here?
Well, first I'll go to, because I'm very interested on what you say about as technologies of life, because I discussed this with Sandra Gonzalez yesterday for hours, because she, like you, didn't agree on me calling them technologies of life. But why I use technologies of life is that I was looking at Artavia Murillo's ruling, and I read the ruling in this order. So people have the right to have access to the medical technologies, to exercise the right to become parents biologically or genetically linked to their children. So when they say that people have the access to those technology, I was thinking like what technology means in that sense. And I think that technology means also the bodies that are going to be used to exercise the right to become parents in the biological sense. So that's why I call them technologies and not labor, because I think that if access is granted, so access is granted to whatever technology you need to become a parent, then they become the technology. And I know that it's just pushing a little bit too much into the sort of technology definition, but it's pushing because the point that I want to make is that I think access is being granted by the court, access to those bodies, and that I think it becomes very problematic. Now the patriarchy is everywhere. So the patriarchy is everywhere because I think that when feminists in Latin America argue that the state is not to be trusted, is because the state is the site of masculine domination, and the state is not to be trusted, the police is not to be trusted. And I think I have not heard any other call so loud in Latin America right now that is not, do not trust the police, do not trust the state, is my friends that look after me. And that call is not only, or is not exclusive to the abortion politic fights. It's everywhere. In every feminist protest, you hear the police doesn't take care of me, the state doesn't look after me, it's my friend, it's my network. And I think that it's a call for the patriarchy that the state represents, at least in Mexico right now, where 10 women are killed every day without anyone being accountable for. So that's another implicit permission there.
You want to go ahead and ask a question?
Thank you so much for the talk. It's really good.
Thanks.
I just wanted to ask, what's the intent from the beginning in that trial for the liberal? Was that
Which trial? Sorry, the Artavia or the...
no, the second one. Yeah.
Before you answer, the people online can't actually hear the audio, so we need to repeat the questions.
Okay, I will. But sorry, what, before looking at the question.
So am I right in thinking that that device was basically within the trial was with the intent to induce a pregnancy and then terminate pregnancy in all cases?
No, the uterine lavage, the intention was the opposite. The intention was to someone at the audience is asking me what was the intention of the uterine lavage, and if the intention of the uterine lavage trial was to terminate pregnancies. But I'm explaining that it is the opposite. So the uterine lavage basically is a product so that people don't have to go through IVF because it's very costly. So they are trying to make something cheaper. So if you want to go through implantation, pre-implantation diagnosis test, and you don't need it, but you just want to use it for any reason, then you can someone could conceive an embryo in vivo through artificial insemination, sperm insemination, and then sort of recollect the embryo and then do the pre-implantation diagnosis. But the thing is that the device is not ready yet. So the device basically didn't work. So these women who were not intended mothers, who were just participants, had pregnancies that were unintended because the device just couldn't wash the embryos.
I wanted to clarify whether it was basically with them taking those women and telling them, we are going to basically induce a pregnancy. We're going to take the blastocyte and so on, but return it back, and you may or may not have a pregnancy. So this is what they've been told.
No, like we are. Can you repeat it?
Is the outcome basically? Did anyone go on to have a successful?
Do you have a follow-up? Oh, there's somebody in the audience who has a follow-up to this.
Sorry, so that maybe in that same line, my question was, what would have happened if the device worked?
Well,
And then the women will be.
what would it happen?
Pregnant.
Yeah,
No.
No,
Blastocyte would have been removed.
and that's it.
Anyway.
So I guess.
Okay, they sorry, they're asking me questions about the uterine lavage. No, the intention was never to get anyone pregnant at all. Yeah, the intention was just to test the device and check if the device was efficient enough to wash out all the embryos. And then they discharge, I think they discharge most of them, but there was one participant that was not a participant in the trial, but an intended mother somewhere there in the process that became pregnant after but no, I mean that the only intention of the uterine lavage is to check if a device can wash out effectively all the embryos or the blastocysts.
Well, having the ethical level, because the intention from the start was never to continue the pregnancy.
No.
And I was just wondering whether their intention was to give the woman a choice whether to continue with the pregnancy or not. How would we look at it ethically?
Ah, yes.
Can you
That
repeat
was-
that? please?
That's why I went around and.
Yeah, like if someone is asking me if what would have happened if maybe if I'm understood well, if participants wanted to continue with the pregnancy, that's what you're asking, if it was an option.
At the beginning, we'll start of the trial saying we are doing this trial, we don't know how well the device works. We are going to remove the last do whatever we need to understand and then see if the implementation is successful. However, you get to choose whether you want to continue with a pregnancy or not, but the chances are maybe it won't be successful because you don't know if the device works.
No, they was the
And I was wondering if someone did that, would we look at it ethically in its own way, as a trial, as a device?
yeah, I mean, they didn't have the choice to continue with the pregnancy, but also the insemination happened with a non-partner sperm. So they didn't have also the choice to decide the sperm that they were going to use. But again, they were not asked if I think the medical abortion was agreed before the clinical trial.
I think it's the arrogance of the
Yes.
trial that this is it. We are going to try this. This will not result in pregnancy. We are inducing a pregnancy, but we are terminating it at the same time, and we're going to look for it.
Yes, yes.
Yes, Rebecca.
So I have a different question, which, I mean, your talk was so interesting, and I would say gathering lots of my thoughts. But it's just something that was said about how bodies were being accessed. And I wondered whether in this in the ethics beyond ethics,
Mhm.
or anywhere else there is discussion about the ethics of what they were asking participants in terms of how their bodies were accessed. Because you have a diagram of what was being done, and obviously there's the insemination, and then there's the lavage, and then there's potentially the abortion. And all of these things are things that are happening, or maybe not the abortion, but that presumably happen through the vagina. There's through constant, invasive, intrusive, internal touching and examination. And I wondered whether any of that was even considered really in the ethical discussion such as this.
Someone is asking me about the ethics of the uterine lavage, but also in terms of access to and how invasive was the clinical trial.
Yeah.
If someone discussed that, I mean, in terms of ethics, yes, there have been. I don't have the name with me, but there have been people discussing the unethical ways of the unethical aspects of the clinical trial. But not really. I mean, now that you mentioned that, it is very impressive how invasive was the clinical trial, but also how the selling point or the aim of the trial was to develop a product that will not be invasive for clients, women, for the ones that will use it in the future. So how that contrasts of how invasive was the trial to what our aim is to develop something that wouldn't be invasive for these other women, right? So I think that's a very interesting contrast there in terms of you are using these bodies in a very invasive way to develop something that you're selling as not invasive is quite shocking in terms of the way that women are differently perceived.
Yeah,
There's questions online, right?
I don't think so far.
Actually, this was, I've been thinking about Yelka's point around why technology, why not make bodies visible or labor visible. But I think, and your point about thinking about how the first court talks about bodies as technologies, I think there's a point of dehumanization here.
Yeah.
And I think what you're saying about the invasiveness, was that considered, was that a feature of it? I think this dehumanization, when you become technology, actually, at least in this context, I think that works really well for how you were thinking.
Thank you. I defended that on yesterday for about 7 hours. Yes, I think, and I think that when if you look at it, sorry, the question was, well, she's just basically agreeing with me that that is not too bold to say that women in the uterine trial as being perceived as the technologies of life, and that what I'm saying is that I agree with her, me agreeing with me. But that I think it becomes clearer if you look at access to the medical technologies that will allow people to have children. Why? Because when you in a context, in Latin American context, where people don't have access to basic human health, public health, when women actually become infertile because they don't have access to the health services that will adequately treat sexual transmitted diseases or safe abortions. In that context, you grant access to these very specific, very highly developed breakthroughs so that people can have genetically linked children. So that's where I think this idea of women as the technologies of life, to which the court is being granted right of access to very, very few privileged people that are going to use them, becomes even more worrying. So yes, we agree.
That's why.
There's a question over there.
Yes, I have, I don't know if I have a question or if it's more of a comment, but I was thinking, linking the two trials, and the last thing that you said after you finished your presentation about how the construction of the idea of women as wanting to be pregnant or to be mothers, and that this technology will help them become mothers, right? Genetically, even though they couldn't conceive, right? And that link reminded me of the first case of Artavia, in which you mentioned one of the rulings was that women, that maternity or motherhood was part of what women's personality is. So I think it's I agree with you in your concern and worry about the direction in which the discussion or the use of technology is being taken or can take women and women's bodies, right? Because then you could have a narrative that says, okay, they're willing, that they signed up for this and they knew. And again, it's their and that's not because we're deciding or we're thinking and we're making all the choices that we have with the autonomy that we could have, but it can be closely linked with its natural, or it's part of the personality of women that need to be mothers, or that feel not to be women and to be women and you need to be mother.
Yeah.
So you're building a narrative there that supports also the future need of this kind of technology, right? That you need to be impregnated and you need to be mother.
But only if you can pay for it.
And again, because you're doing those trials again with, it connects with what you were saying, that the invasive treatment was done in the trial in Mexico with women that you don't know, and but technology will be set for women that won't have that invasive. So it's again the contradiction. I know there are many topics.
Yes, certainly. Yes, and I think that. Can you repeat? Can I repeat the whole one?
Well, just summarize it.
I don't know. Well, we're talking about Artavia and how Artavia's ruling about women's personality so linked with maternity. Actually, the ruling also included a mention about the urge. They say the urge of women to become mothers. So I think that we're talking about Artavia in that part of the ruling and how that part of the ruling may feed these kind of breakthroughs and these trials, right? These clinical trials, if I understood well, I can repeat it like that exactly. But yes, and I think that's why it becomes urgent to see, well, not urgent, but I would like to analyze when these authors that I quoted look at how courts moderate social movements narrative. I think it will be very interesting to go back and see what was the negotiation there. What did we actually win something? Is it being one of the questions yesterday with my colleague friend was saying how much, and I've been asking this to Latin Americans, how much has been invoked in court Artavia Murillo for abortion politics? Because when I look at it, when I look at the commission, the National Commission Bioethics, invoke Artavia in the realm of MRTs, I was shocked. Like, oh my God, Artavia is here and we don't know why. Why is Artavia here? And then I was like, of course, why? Because all of those rulings. But it will be very interesting to know how often this landmark, because it is our Latin American Roe v. Wade, I think. At least that's how people think about it. So
yes, Lucy and Paula.
Okay. I'm actually thinking of two things, tangential, I think. The first is how this can also be translated into, if I'm troubling the sense of clinical trials and how clinical trials travel through borders with certain concepts that don't travel through borders and are completely different. And this also happens in HIV prevention trials. So I'm also from Mexico, and I've worked in a clinic, an HIV clinic, where Mosaico, the vaccine prevention trial, works. And I think it's really interesting the way of how we think of this topic of vulnerability or autonomy in itself. Because the researchers, when they went there, they were trying to get men who were having sex with men, but they problematically included transgender women inside the category. And they didn't actually contend with the idea. They were like, we want to recruit as many transgender women as we can, but they don't understand the context of Mexico and Latin America, that the transgender women are like, no, because this isn't for us. Like, we clearly understand that this isn't for us, this trial won't work for us, and you don't even understand our lives in this. And so they they saw very clearly in the community context of transgender women how it wasn't going to work for them and how this technology was way outside. And I'm also thinking of the idea of motherhood in Latin America in another sense, precisely for transgender women. There's this author, Camila Sosa, that is from Argentina. And she talks about the idea of motherhood and how that is also very embedded of the idea in transgender women. And actually, I've been thinking a lot about my community service and how they dealt with not being able to have children biologically, but how it was solved through the community in lesbian couples, in other causes of infertility that clearly couldn't know because the lack of medical equipment, technology, access, whatever. And so it is like really important to state how these borders are being traveled across. But that is clearly not for us because we don't even see that we have different ways of solving motherhood in other ways, in communitarian ways. And access through different. So who is this technology being invoked for? Like who is going to be the profit of it? Because of course, and since that the amount of genetic companies that have been in Mexico City has been astounding, like a lot. And the for-profit ethical committees as well. There have been like a huge amount of ethical committees for-profit that has been growing in Mexico City, and it's worrying.
Yes, yes.
Lucy, and is there anyone besides Lucy who has a question? Because we're coming up against the time limit. Okay, so Lucy, if you want to add a short question, then you have to summarize both of those. And then...
I don't know if I have a question. But there is this way in which I feel like these technologies, whether we're talking about our own technology as reproductive entities, or the way the state uses or the patriarchy exploits our technology and dehumanizes us, right? But there is also this piece that I was a doula for a really long time and a community midwife, and I worked in abortion clinics and companioned a lot of folks in lots of different ways. And so I always go back to this place that I would see occasionally or experience myself, like in self-help groups, of experimenting with your body as liberatory. And these technologies all hold that, right? Like even the IUI, even an abortion, especially an abortion for me, but anyway, like all of these pieces have this space where in some context it's so liberatory and in some context it's so exploitative. Yeah. And so I guess I just wanted to name that and bring it into this discussion because I think that it sometimes gets glossed over in these discussions, but that there is something speculative and liberatory in something even so horrible as like this very unethical trial, right? And that's why I go back to this idea of like, would I think about this particular sequence of events differently if it was located in people who, in individual collectives who were driving it? And that's the end of my question.
I mean, if I could just briefly follow up on that. I also feel like the interesting thing about the two technologies are very different, obviously, that you're talking about. And it seems to me that uterine lavage is kind of a low-tech technology, a low-tech alternative to IVF, which counteracts a lot of the ovarian stimulation, and the huge pharmaceutical requirement for IVF is no longer there, including and the need for an embryology lab and all those things. So say theoretically, if this was successful, then it could really pose a threat. But what you see at the same time is that this is framed by Santiago Monet, who is the guy who's totally invested in genetic testing. And so the aim doesn't seem to be, let's make a low-cost alternative to IVF, but rather, I mean, IVF for those indications that you mentioned, but rather, how can we broaden the indication for using reproductive technologies for everybody to say, you should get your embryos tested, even if you have a sort of unassisted kind of conception, through PGTA or through PGTM or whichever one it is, and use genetic companies that Paula was referring to for non-assisted reproduction as well. And that's where the capitalist narrative that you already see in the thing comes in. But it's not inherent in necessarily this technology, but it is inherent in, not inherent, but like it seems to be coming from the fact of who's participating in the trial and who's funding it. So yeah, I just want to add that.
Oh my God, it really sounds absolutely impossible, but okay, I'll try to, well, the first question was about clinical trials in the context of IVF, I mean, not IVF, of HIV, right? And well, she said, you say many other things, but what I'll say about that is, and about how certain notions of kinship just don't belong to local contexts of how we think about reproduction, or trans women think about reproduction, but maybe a lot of people in Mexico think about reproduction and kinship. I remember interviewing women in the domestic service, domestic workers saying, well, I'm the mother of all my brothers and sisters, so why would I, I already being a mother, I'm already the mother. And they celebrate 10th of May and everything, right? Mother's Day and everything. But one of the things that I think that is very important with clinical trials is that we hear a lot of cases where when clinical trials are very beneficial, the global south is not included in those clinical trials, never. So for instance, in the summit, we heard from Victoria Gray, who is the first person who was treated with gene therapy for sickle cell disease. And then we discussed things about price and accessibility, because the price is between $1 and $3.5 million per patient. So she was a trial. So we're not going to see a lot of gene therapies going on in somatic genome therapies because prices are impossible. So, but one of the first thing I thought, well, yes, of course, we will never see something like that. So why are clinical trials so differently? So, because when I started to look at clinical trials, and I was like, why every time that there's something that is like the American physicians say, well, in Mexico, because there are no rules. And when we look at, for instance, human genome editing, and we criticize the policy landscape that they are being built around human genome editing, and how these policy landscapes say, well, this is the South and this is the North, and this is, where maybe the next CRISPR baby will be born because there's nothing there. Well, the same can be said about clinical trials, right? So every time that you don't run risk of there is a lot of benefits, you never look at the South, and they're never included. Africa, for instance, Latin America, India, they never included in the trials that are going to benefit them. So I think that the trans women were right, knowing that they were not going to be benefited from that trial. And I think in terms of kinship and notions of genetic relatedness, I think that is something that I would like to look for in my next project, like how, because I keep listening to, what would be the social consensus, what would people think about human genome editing in the global south or genetic relatedness, but no one goes there and asks people, what do you think about it? They're just like, yeah, we should ask them, and then they just like, sit down and don't actually go and ask them. It's not the same. I think that a lot of scientists are assuming that acknowledging the need to ask people what they think is the same as actually asking people what they think about something. Like, oh, we already said that was important. So, and in terms of what you were saying about if we can have another look at this technology from another perspective that actually involves the people, or is beneficial for the people that are involved in other ways. So maybe think about an uterine lavage or something that is not done by these companies or doctors, but by women that accompany other women, or women in this networks of acompañantes. And I think you're very right. I mean, this is also a thing about authoritative knowledge. Who has the right to use and think and design technologies that will help women's reproductive experiences? The same thing, well, one of the things that I'm looking at in this first chapter, I'll talk about the chapter, you have to see they're finished, but in the first chapter, I look at breast cancer. And I look at how now they want to involve traditional parteras, traditional, traditional midwives into the breast cancer prevention. But then they took them away because of misoprostol use. So in the 1980s, parteras were part of the global agenda of maternity. But because they started to prescribe misoprostol to prevent maternal mortality, parteras were out of the picture in the global agenda. And that was a case of authoritative knowledge. They were not given the authoritative knowledge to prescribe misoprostol to prevent maternal mortality. It was not even for abortion. So they are out of the picture because of that. So now that they want to bring them back, because they want to prevent breast cancer. Well, you just took them before. Yeah, I mean, you disappeared them from you before, so now you want them back. So yes.
I can't wait to read your book.
Oh, I can,
Well, let's also